Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on capitalizing carbon revenues for EV charging with the Connecticut Green Bank and partners, such as Forth and Volta. We have Matt Macunas from the Green Bank, the Connecticut Green Bank, Sue Hall from the Climate Neutral Business Network, and Abdellah from Volta. All right, so glad to have all of you on here today. All right. Our agenda for today is below, and we are really excited to explore how carbon capital markets can accelerate your deployment of EV chargers today. And we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session after Matt and Sue take it from here. All right, over to you, Sue.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for joining us here this morning. It's exciting to explore with you how a whole diverse array of charging networks and partners can now gain access to the carbon credit, the carbon capital markets in order to access new revenues to accelerate your charger deployment efforts. I think the first question really that we want to look at is, what is this carbon capital market, and how does one access it? These carbon revenues, this carbon capital arises in principle because there are companies such as Google or Microsoft, university campuses, cities, individuals across not only the country but the world who would like to be able to purchase the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that your EV charging systems are delivering by virtue of powering cleaner electric vehicles to displace fossil fuel-based emissions. And these folks who would like to be able to achieve their net zero goals or go carbon neutral will pay for those carbon reductions. But obviously, if a payment is going to be made to help encourage your deployment of EV charging, there has to be some integrity behind the system that by which you claim that you have got this ton of carbon reduced, such that it can be transacted in a financial market, so that it can be securitized. So to capitalize those carbon reductions that your networks are delivering, there's a certification process, which groups like the Verified Carbon Standard, the preeminent global certifier for carbon credits internationally, they all step forward in order to provide a level of assurance for those buyers that these credits have integrity and indeed deliver on the promise that you're making. For your credits to go through that certification process, there has to be, to start with, the rules of the road, the basic protocols by which your carbon reductions from EV charging specifically can be evaluated and certified. For that to be a reality, there needs to be a carbon methodology, and that's the first piece of the puzzle, which over the last many years, several partners, including the Green Bank, stepped forward to create a carbon methodology dedicated to EV charging that is now accredited by the Verified Carbon Standard. Once that's in place, projects like the one which the bank is developing can come forward and be certified and accredited against that protocol and have the reductions from the EV chargers with all their partners that they're delivering certified and issued. Obviously, once they've been issued and certified by VCS, the credits can go into a registry, be purchased, and then retired on behalf of the planet. So that's essentially the basic mechanisms of how the carbon voluntary capital market works. And in order for your EV charging credits to now come forward and earn those revenues, we owe quite a considerable debt to a coalition that we formed about 4 or 5 years ago now, the EV Charging Carbon Coalition. The bank was a founding member of the coalition, as was Electrify America, with the VW group, and folks like Exelon and EVgo, Siemens, and the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. This network, this coalition that you might have heard from at some of the earlier Forth conferences, did the heavy lifting to actually create that tailored EV charging carbon methodology, which the Verified Carbon Standard accepted and accredited. So they basically had the key that unlocks the door that now enables you and your charging networks to access these carbon revenues. So we owe them a considerable debt of gratitude. What's particularly exciting, I think, in this brave new world of owning carbon credits for your charging networks, is the approach that the Green Bank has now stepped forward to create, which enables a whole diversity of partners to come forward and access that carbon credit in a really innovative, simple, and streamlined fashion. So, Matt, over to you. What's that all about?
Well, thanks, Sue. I appreciate that. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. We're happy to welcome these conversations with new parties interested in our help scoping this opportunity and to work with the Green Bank and finding an easier path to that carbon capital that Sue was just articulating, rather than trying it out on your own. The Green Bank is a state-established financing entity. Our mission is to mobilize private capital into the deployment of clean energy technologies, and that includes electric vehicle charging. We've done over $2 billion in transactions so far. We're super excited about this one. We're actually going beyond the state boundaries to do it. And so we're working upstream with the market, and we welcome your participation here. This is a multi-partner project with grouped locations, and that's pretty uncommon. To our knowledge, we're the only ones doing this in the transport electrification space under that sort of formatting. So using that open architecture, we can add others in to our umbrella, and they could bring in chargers that they deem interested, that they're interested in bringing in to the project as inventory into our carbon offset project. So you might be an OEM, you might be a network or data systems provider, you might be an installer, you might be a site host, a fleet owner. We like you all just fine, as long as the project makes sense for you. Then we want to help democratize access to it in order to help you go about getting it. So back to you, Sue, with a little bit of what they can expect in terms of modeling scenarios and assumptions.
Fantastic. Well, I think the first question that most folks ask is, what's this worth to me? If I bring in carbon credits, say over a first 10 years worth of crediting years, what kind of revenues could I expect? What kind of return on capital? And from some of the modeling that we did very early on with the EV Charging Carbon Coalition, we looked at this question both for level 2 chargers and for DC fast chargers, with kind of utilization rates that were considered reasonable at the time. And obviously, your utilization rates are going to vary. More kilowatts and miles delivered, more carbon you're going to earn. But what we were finding overall was that somewhere between $5 and $10 a ton, taking that as our assumption for the carbon pricing, those first 10 years of revenues were delivering something like a 5 to 10% return on capital, the capital investment to get the chargers in the ground. And that's providing a very intriguing and strategic layer of funding there that can strengthen the business fundamentals for your charging systems and accelerate charger deployment. When we look at this from a number of different angles in terms of the kinds of challenges that can arise to get chargers deployed in different settings, that 10-year revenue figure starts to look intriguing. So a few quick examples. If one's a utility, many utilities have been paying somewhere around about $500 as an incentive to get level 2s installed in residences. I've got one in my garage. Those 10-year revenues, deliver kind of comparable levels of funding. So for a utility, it could enable them to tap into a private capital market rather than just going to the PUC to kind of ask for funds from ratepayers. Another rather intriguing kind of barrier, I think of as the Starbucks problem. We've got kind of mini malls where a Starbucks, for example, doesn't necessarily own the car park around their vicinity. It's owned by an independent landlord, many of which have been perhaps more reluctant to install EV chargers than there might have been the case if you've got a site where there's stronger agency. But again, the revenues from, for example, a DC fast charger installed in such a setting could actually pay for the value of an individual parking space in that kind of location, which provides an incentive for a landlord to embrace this opportunity rather than seeing it purely as a headache and a barrier that otherwise would mean that this was, not something that would be worth pursuing particularly. So there are creative ways to think about the revenues that come in and the ways in which they can be deployed to overcome the particular barriers in individual settings that a particular network, might be facing. So I guess the next question that one tends to ask oneself is, well, okay, fine, that sounds intriguing. Do I qualify? Am I eligible? Okay, Matt, what's the answer to that question?
All right. Well, there's a lot of information to go over here. So aside from it being one of our less pretty slides, we're going to stall here for just a moment. Eligibility is pretty broad. According to the protocol that we set up, in theory, even if you had a 110-volt wall socket, or albeit maybe a few thousand of them, and you wanted to bring them to us, I think you still could. But we're really talking about level 2 chargers, fast chargers of all stripes, serving heavy-duty fleets, pantographs, etc. There are some bells and whistles that one could bring to this project if desired. Time of use, time varying emissions profiles, vehicle to grid, dedicated renewables and storage to remove upstream emissions from the crediting equation, so that you no longer have to factor those in. Those are all potentially able to get brought in here. We mentioned data being required. There's defaults available to use here. For dumb chargers, and some of the options in that direction, they're just a little bit less generous as the crediting would be of some data actuals. So partners should be thinking about that and something else when they come to this project. It's a couple key criteria. It's a line of sight on that kilowatt hour data. There's I think you're going to want to easily sort out when you're talking with myself and Sue Hall, for example, those chargers installed by year, by state, and what that kilowatt hour output is. And then you're good. You also, however, want a line of custody on the environmental attribute of that charging transaction. If you don't own the charger itself, that's fine. But a contract will have to say who those attributes are assigned to. So that lets you, in turn, assign them to the green bank so that we can transact them on your behalf and access those markets and further democratize them for any of the other actors here. Another factor here is that we don't double count offsets. Folks who know California's low carbon fuel standard market, they often make that comparison, and yeah, it does work somewhat similar. This is instead of that because it's outside California and applicable to all other places, or applicable if California or any other jurisdiction with an emissions cap on it of that sort changes their rules and then allows offsetting in. Where there's a carbon cap in other jurisdictions outside California, they would just have to provide for some allowance for the use of voluntary offsets. And with that, you would be able to count those in those jurisdictions as well. There's also a global reach available on this. When this methodology was set up, it was deemed to have what's called a positive list of 40 countries where it can be used. And it's, put simply, I like to say anywhere but Norway, because as we all know, they don't need a ton of help up there. Norway has a very large amount of electric vehicle penetration with their on-road fleet already. For everybody else, or rather for every place else, you've got a rule by the methodology that states that you can get crediting until that jurisdiction, whether it's a country or a state, has achieved 5% or more on-road penetration of the overall passenger vehicle fleet or heavy-duty fleet. If over 5% of that on a rolling basis on a 5-year term, as it's evaluated by Verified Carbon Standard, is exceeded, then no new chargers can get qualified into the project, but the existing chargers can still qualify in and continue crediting throughout that. So it's really meant as an early market position with what's called in the offsetting world additionality aspect of it, where in the early days it moves the market, but simply. Let's see, beyond that, and you'll see different shading here for the US that indicates pre-approval of the heavy-duty sector as well. There are a few distinct advantages to working with the Green Bank versus establishing your own projects. One of them would be a unique look back period because, well, not only because we were collaborators in the methodology, but because we set it up early with our project. We've got the ability to do a one-time look back, which reaches further into previous years than anyone else starting a project would be able to get. Normally, you could do chargers installed anytime 2 years prior to when you're getting your project validated and verified. In our case, we could reach back to August of 2016 because that's when the Green Bank in Rocky Hill, Connecticut installed its charger and then enrolled its charger. So because of that nuance, we're able to qualify in chargers installed anytime after August of 2016. On this first transaction that we plan to run around the middle of this year, we'll be looking toward vintage years 2016 through 2020 and transacting those credits. And then we have the idea moving forward of doing this once a year, where we look back 1.5 to 2 years for chargers more recently installed. So this means you've got a one-time opportunity here that would otherwise vanish to be enrolling your chargers in order to meet that 2021 certification deadline that we're doing, or else all that crediting is off the table and those charger sites would not be available for crediting in years moving forward in the future. So the urgency with which you might want to approach the Green Bank might be dictated by that. What does your fleet look like? There's also another advantage, and that's a 30-year potential crediting period. VCS, Verified Carbon Standard, has a set of rules that apply across all of its eligible methodologies. And for some reasons that didn't have to do with this, they revised those rules to constrict the crediting period. But it was after we already established our project and got that grandfathered in. So under the rules that we were able to use, VCS 3.8, we are eligible for 10-year crediting terms. And then those can be renewed twice, which gives you a runway of 30 years of potential crediting into the future, not just at current numbers, but at increased deployment rates, at increased kilowatt hours dispensed rates, with much higher numbers potentially in those out years available to you. Anyone else establishing a project in the last year or so, or even moving forward, they're limited to 21 years, which is the new rules. And so those are two really key differentiators where it advantages the Green Bank's grouped open architecture project. And so if you're joining in with us, then we'll give you some support. We've got some templates, tools, simple tick box styles rather than an essay contest that you would have to get into if you wanted to do this sort of crediting. And of course, a lot of hand-holding and guidance because there is a nuanced world of carbon offsets that carries its own particular rules and terminologies, and we will be able to help you understand that. Moving on, I do want to share the screen here with one of our valued partners here, Dr. Abdellah Cherkaoui. I'm sure I did not pronounce that correctly, sir. I do apologize. But a very important partner in this project with Volta Charging. We couldn't be more excited to be partnering with them, not only for what they bring to the allowance of free publicly hosted charging in Connecticut, for which we are, of course, forever grateful, but all around the country and elsewhere. So I wanted to give me the opportunity to share some perspectives as well. You might be on mute, sir.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Sue. I want to first really highlight the work that was done by both Matt and Sue, and it really is developing the methodology to bring EV charging into carbon projects. This is unique, this is fundamental, and this is incredibly positive in helping every single company that thrives and drives electric vehicle charging. It's infrastructure, it's capital expensive, and having the ability to make this part as carbon project and really as VCS, as a verified carbon, it really makes a huge difference. So that's one. And thank you, both Sue and Matt. You know, the number two for Volta has been, you know, we have a different model that drives huge utilization and therefore makes a lot of sense to trade carbon credits with companies, you know, that have negative or deficits, you know, in those projects, and that for us that's really key. So we were in it since the beginning. It took some time. It was a lot of work, but I think this project is absolutely fantastic. And for me, the last bit is the ability to bring everyone around this, and having Connecticut Green Bank doing something around the voluntary market, you know, versus what we do in California, where it's driven by carbon. We are also actually quite thankful for that as well. Or in Oregon, we, you know, the clean fuel programs. It's really all of these programs are actually really key to help drive, well, not only the companies that, you know, provide clean fuels or clean fuel programs, and the company that, well, have to to buy those credits from all of us, and that, I think that's really important. Aggregating those under an umbrella, Matt, is really good, and it's really helpful because, you know, for Volta builds and operates really great EV charging. So having the help of the Connecticut Green Bank, you know, managing that is really helpful for us. You know, we do it ourselves in Oregon or California, but I have to be honest, it's really nice to have the ability to do it everywhere else. And that's something that's really fantastic.
Fantastic. Thanks, Abdullah. That's really kind of you. I think you know, one of the things that I've been struck by in terms of the diversity of partners that have come into the bank's project so far is they've come in from so many different kind of ports of call. You know, alongside Volta, that's got this wonderful way of capitalizing kind of, you know, revenues from so many different levels of private markets, whether it's carbon credits or advertising revenues. I mean, you know, your business model is absolutely fascinating. You know, there's Proterra, and they're looking to kind of potentially extend that carbon credit capital available to their clients. You know, Yugo came in with many of their chargers, were recently acquired by Blink that now wants to bring all of their network in. So it's fascinating because I think no matter, as Matt mentioned, no matter where you sit within the ecosystem, there are opportunities for you to potentially bring the credits available, not only to your own network if you own and operate it, but also to the networks that you might have a linkage to as some kind of value-added service. So in that context, I think one question that we should definitely kind of like touch on here is, well, okay, that sounds intriguing. You know, how do we get this going? What are the short-term steps? And I think in many ways, the kind of the very first question would be, well, are your objectives aligned? And that's something that pretty much one ought to be able to evaluate even on this webinar. You know, would accessing a new source of private capital funding be something that would be intriguing to you? And could it be used to accelerate, you know, your deployment of chargers or overcome some of those other market barriers? If in principle that sounds intriguing, then it would be time to kind of contact Whit and have a follow-up conversation with him at Fourth, or to get in touch with Matt, myself, through the Green Bank. And the early stages that and questions that we would answer there really revolve around your own carbon business case. You'll notice that I pulled in some very early numbers from the EVCCC carbon business case. And there are some assumptions there. You know, we were assuming roughly 10 kilowatt hours per charging event. We had capital numbers that looked at the equipment values that go back to about 2016. Now, every company that we've ever worked with has got a very kind of tailored set of numbers. And we look at those across different geographies, the carbon numbers vary by state because the carbon intensity of your electricity varies by region. There are partners who are looking at this opportunity internationally. So, getting your tailored carbon business case down is really important as a first step, and then taking a look at your networks and ensuring around things like ownership and some of those other key facets that there's a good fit between your project and what the bank is going to be able to succeed in taking through the VCS verification and certification process. So those are your early steps, and then the bank really kind of steps in even further and takes a lot of the kind of complexity out of the remaining steps needed to get you through certification. So I'm going to pass this one back to Matt. And this might look complicated, but the good news is Matt's doing all the work. So what happens after that, Matt?
Yeah, and the good news is that we already covered the first two steps. So, goodness of fit, it works. Working with the Green Bank to get that indicative carbon business case for what is this worth to you potentially, we covered that. So this presumes that you're well situated to be working with this and that you want to commit. What comes after that? Bringing that concept of what you'd like to enroll for crediting, and after we scope that potential for you and jointly figure out if it's right, well, we'll get into a non-binding good faith MOU, essentially working toward the same goals as we're en route to a formal business contract. So essentially, we know on both sides we're investing our time productively and with a target in mind here. And then checking, are you ready with the project design where this fits with the systems that you've set up and with what you're bringing in? Are you bringing in your own network? It is, for some reason, another network that you've got the ability to be engaging with us on, where these pledges and assignments of rights of carbon environmental attributes and the line of sight to that kilowatt hour data, is it right there in your pocket, or is it established through a chain of contracts, right? So scoping for what that project looks like, and then getting into our systems, those tailored templates that we had set up just for this project. We would be asking you to share that sort of data so that we could pre-populate those documents that are required to be submitted into the verified carbon standard. And then we would get into a formal business agreement that essentially says the Green Bank is going to be receiving what you're pledging right here for these environmental attributes of the charging transaction. We owe you these things in return, and we will do X, Y, Z. We will pledge to you that we will good faith market these offsets that end up being certified by VCS so that we could sell them also on your behalf and then remit them back to you after covering for the Green Bank's 25% fee, covering our administrative costs. One of the other differentiators that I didn't mention when it comes to the Green Bank's project is the Green Bank itself. We're not a for-profit institution. We're a state-backed financing entity who's mission-oriented. We're trying to solve climate change, essentially, and we're working upstream here to do it. So we're not trying to get rich off of increasing that fee basis on you. We're trying to cover our costs and lift the market while we're at it. So after we do that, although I skipped right to the end right there, verified carbon standard, we'll get that certified, and then right back to the end here. We will remit those proceeds back to you. We're already in and have been in forward commitment conversations for the strips of these offsets with brokers and other various purchasers into the future so that we can get that sounding of the market and know how these will land and get those commitments in advance. So we're already doing that work on the back end as we speak. Sue, we might be putting it back to you.
Fantastic. Well, so it's wonderful to have an opportunity to explore this with you all, and a big thanks to Forth here with the kind of value-added services that they're notorious for in helping to facilitate a lot of these conversations to take place. So I know we've got a Q&A session coming up here, but feel free to reach out to Whit, to Matt, in order to get kind of like the conversations rolling so that we can capitalize the credits on your behalf. So with that, I think we're into half an hour or so of questions and discussions that might be helpful.
This is a nuanced world, so of course we're happy to provide that explanation. Whit, are you going to be moderating this?
Yeah, for sure. So we have a few questions. I believe we may have already had some of them answered, but Sue, a recap on what is the time frame for the DC and level 2 charging from the first table? Wonder if we should go back to that first slide if it's worthwhile.
Sure. I think what we were looking at here. Whoop, okay.
Too far.
I'll drive.
You'll drive.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so this was the EV Charging Carbon Coalition business case. And the kind of levels of DC fast charger and level 2 investments for the chargers at that point in time date back to that point in time. As I mentioned a little later, in the presentation, rather than simply assuming that for your network there's a 5 to 10% return, the very first step in the analysis that Matt and I would do with you is to look in a very specific way at your network. Where is it located across different states? How many chargers? What are the kinds of levels of kilowatt hours that you're delivering through those chargers over time? What kind of expansion might you expect in terms of the number of chargers that you'd be expecting to come into your network, say through 2026? Do you expect any increase in the level of utilization? Here we were assuming about 10 kilowatt hours per charging event. So, that gives us a much more nuanced idea of what your carbon credit potential looks like. And those are precisely the kind of figures which, not in a detailed fashion, but in terms of an overall summary expected emission reductions, would get reported out in your carbon credit project validation document. It would give an estimate of those reductions. Going into your verification in the project, when you come to issue your credits each year, we're not going to be asking what you think your credits look like or what you think your kilowatt hours are going to be. We're going to be asking you to provide documentation for what your kilowatt hours actually have been, and a little bit of supporting evidence, normally something from the kind of back of house system that you've been using. And so your actual credits would be paid out commensurate with the specific kilowatt hours that you've delivered in each different region.
And Sue, what time frame is that 5 to 10% modeling over? Is that 1 year's credits, 30 years credits, somewhere in between, just to give an indicative sense of it?
It's the first 10 years of crediting period.
Thank you.
Right, it's the first tranche, really. Thank you. Good clarification.
All right. Next question is from Victoria. In this program, are the chargers actually reassigned over to the bank, or are the chargers remained owned by obviously the networks and such?
Ownership of the hardware, all the assets that are tangible, they stay with whomever they should stay with. The only thing that is assigned to the bank is the environmental attribute of the charging transaction, the avoided greenhouse gas emissions reduction, or rather the reduced greenhouse gas emissions that come from that activity compared against a reference case with internal combustion engines. It's kind of like in the renewable energy sector, a renewable energy credit embodies the environmental aspects of that project activity. It's the same thing. So you're essentially committing to the green bank the intangible, which might be money left on the table for you anyway, because it's not getting spoken for elsewhere. Yeah, I think that should answer that.
All right. How does this work for charging as a service? Any examples of that happening right now?
Let me take this one.
Go for it.
So first, to your point, Matt, and this is an intangible money left on the table that has been created by this group, by Connecticut Green Bank, and that is really what's meaningful. And that essentially is when companies create cleaning up or essentially providing fueling that's clean versus not, then that creates the opportunity for this service. That's the best way I can put it.
Yeah, the business model isn't so material.
So therefore, if you have a charging as a service, or if you are essentially developing you are developing all the opportunities to remove gasoline miles and replace them with cleaner miles, then, well, you actually makes, you're available for, you can get this service.
Yeah, there's a variety of partners up and down the EV charging value chain, like I mentioned before. So, if it's as a service, if it's turnkey, if you're the OEM or installer, there's opportunities there. It just depends on how you write your contracts to a certain effect.
How you write the contract.
All right. Is any capital being used to buy future offsets to help them get cash faster? And it looks like Justin revisited that and said, maybe ask just Greg's question. Is Connecticut Green Bank in the position to make upfront discounted payments for future income streams from the carbon credits in order to finance the upfront installation costs of EV chargers?
It's a great and informed question, and we're the perfect sort of entity that you'd want to be asking that, as we tend to do that in other dimensions of life. This is our inaugural transaction right here, so I wouldn't say we're situated to do it in 2021. Give us a little time to prove this out and think about it as we start to cycle this on an annual basis, and we could explore that. But it's a great question.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add a little to that. The verified carbon standard will only issue credits on an ex-ante basis. So you have to have delivered the reductions before the credits can be issued. So that locks the issuance of credits into that kind of annual cadence. So it requires the kind of sophistication that the bank potentially can bring to the market in order to figure out whether there are mechanisms that can be brought to bear that would facilitate that kind of more upfront transaction. The carbon market, if you look at the kind of levels of pricing, now I am not someone to predict this, and I have over 20, 30 years never ever ventured into what do you think the carbon price is going to look like, Sue. But I think it's fair to say that we are probably entering a more carbon constrained world as we look out over the next several decades. And so, it might be great to be paid out up front, but just bear in mind that actually getting paid annually could enable you to take advantage potentially of situations in which the market pricing for carbon varies into the future.
Right, risk gets priced, and if we're shouldering delivery risk in future years, not being fully certain of being able to compel a partner's data coming out to an incentive that was already provided, that's the sort of thing that we need to navigate in terms of constructing that arrangement for you. Yeah.
All right. Our next question is, do you have any municipal partners yet? And you talked about double counting in regulated markets, but could you revisit that topic perhaps in the context of East Coast states that have signed on to TCI? I might need some background on TCI, but I'm sure Sue and Matt might know more.
Yeah, normally in the double counting realm, I kick it over to Sue, but I am in an East Coast state, and I know very much about TCI. So starting at the start, we don't currently have municipal partners. We're in open conversations with a number of different partners who have begun initiating with us after we did a press splash on this back in December about our initial 4 partners. So we would certainly be open to that conversation with the municipality if they had the assets that are ready to get brought in or that they plan to be bringing in, and if they are doing that at such scale that it makes sense so as to be worth their time in making that collaborative effort with us. When it comes to TCI, that would be the Transportation Climate Initiative. It's been getting engineered for about 11 years now. Georgetown Climate Center was at the center of it, and it was maybe around a dozen northeast of mid-Atlantic states collaborating on a cap and invest system for the transportation sector. So I don't know if that would be exactly like LCFS, but think of it in comparable terms with a credit trading schema that reinvests into clean transport and eventually cleans up that sector. So with TCI, we made sure not to go into this blindly, knowing that there was a potential government overlay that was going to get dropped onto a number of dense East Coast states. We didn't want to establish a project and then get bumped out by inadvertently having them set up a system where maybe they just by fiat assign all the carbon value to the upstream oil dealers who are subject to the credit trading system. So we made sure to, after this methodology was approved in September of 2018, we started in on a regulatory push to make sure that that voice was heard. Electrify America did the same thing, and a few of our partners did the same thing in terms of submitting comments into the open stakeholder sessions, suggesting to the TCI states, hey, there's something here, there's a market getting developed. Make sure that when you engineer around that, you engineer around that. And you don't engineer right through it accidentally. And so I was really heartened to learn as of, it was maybe 3 to 5 weeks ago, there was a announcement from the Transportation Climate Initiative. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. were the inaugural states to be joining in on that, with the idea of enabling it through legislation and regulation. And on the MOU for draft language that they all signed, there was language saying that they shall consider the existence of offset markets, and to some limited extent, we were only asking for 1 or 2% of a set aside when it comes to their overall market. To some extent, they shall be considering offset markets. I'm only halfway mimicking what the language was right there, but it made me very much more comfortable with this project moving forward, regardless of whether or not TCI was opted into by these states. So the possibility is there. And although I can't prognosticate, just like Sue doesn't have a crystal ball on carbon offset prices in the future, regulated carbon offset prices under TCI, I couldn't fully predict that myself offhand. Anything could change. But when you've got offset credits possibly qualifying in to a government-run system, depending on how they work that, then that might have an informative effect on what the value of the offsets are, different from those sorts of bilateral contracts that we just negotiate one-on-one for these credit sales with different brokers. So that could establish a different market price right there, potentially. That's my long-winded answer to that, Whit.
Mm-hmm. One small quick add. I think one of the really important features in the memorandum that Matt was describing so eloquently there was the fact that the states referenced set-aside reserves. And there are precedents for how set-aside reserves have been used to be able to accommodate offset credits that were generated inside the CAPS region under the covered sectors. And the precedent for that, and I won't go into it, but Washington State established a cap with just such a set-aside that enabled energy efficiency and transport credits to be generated from inside the state. And so it's the combination of being able to apply offset technology with the set-aside reserve that is already also baked into TCI that looks particularly intriguing in terms of having the option, potentially for states within the TCI cap, to accommodate EV charging credits that are generated within the TCI region. Okay, next question.
Whit, you might be on mute.
Thank you. All right. Could you revisit the layering of carbon intensity offsets? Sorry, CI. It might just be carbon offsets created by the projects, which may include solar, anaerobic digestion, battery storage, as well as EV charging stations. The layer.
So
Yes.
Sue, take a crack at it.
Okay, so there are provisions within the methodology for incorporating what's referenced as associated infrastructure. So that could be on-site battery storage, increasingly common now for DC fast chargers to avoid demand charges. It could be on-site renewables, wind, solar panel, that can be on-site, or it can be renewables that you are accessing directly through the grid for your project. So not renewable energy credits, but renewables that you have purchased directly into your project. And so a lot of the more sophisticated charging systems can be accommodated into your carbon credit calculations. The methodology has kind of future-proofed with a whole bunch of, particularly of project emission equations, whose math I would be glad to go into with you, but I couldn't possibly do it on the webinar. But love to have a follow-up call with you, which would enable you to take advantage of those much more sophisticated kind of infrastructure systems and charging structures that you can put in going forward.
Excellent. And our last question so far is, have you considered issuing carbon credits based on miles driven?
Not yet,
Well,
but but it's intriguing, Sue.
Well, the short answer to that actually is yes, potentially. We have had inquiries coming in from potential partners and that have asked, hey, we've got telematics based on the vehicles that are part of the fleets that are getting charged by our charging networks. Can we take data from the telematics in the vehicles, which is partly you're monitoring miles driven, but you're also monitoring with the telematics the kilowatt hours that have been supplied by the charger. But the data comes, as it were, from the vehicle, not from the chargers. So we went back to the verified carbon standard kind of early on and said, hey, we're getting these kind of questions coming in. Would this work? They basically said, yes, with a few kind of changes here and there. So if you're using a telematics type system by which you're monitoring not just miles driven, but the kilowatt hours that have been supplied by the charger, because the kilowatt data coming out of the charger basically matches the kilowatt data coming in through the telematics. So in that sense, if you've got that kind of a structure, the answer is yes, but we're still actually basing it on the kilowatt hours that the telematics has received. It's possible. There are other carbon methodologies like the CDM AMS3C that are based on fleets. They're a great deal more clunky and not nearly as sophisticated as the kind of practices that are incorporated in the EV charging methodology. So, the answer to that question really is that's a longer conversation, and give us a call and let's learn a little bit more about why that's of interest to you, because there are potential.
Sue, if I may jump in. So, and it's a really, really good question. That's one. And two, it's exactly what you said, which is if we measure, we're delivering kilowatt hours, those kilowatt hours are miles driven. So we are essentially measuring and rewarding miles driven on electric. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, and I was interpreting that initially in a different direction. So thank you for that clarification, Sue. That was excellent.
Well said. A new question that just came in: is it acceptable to capture both a carbon offset and a clean fuel credit? And I think we've danced around that quite a lot, but simple up or down, is it acceptable to capture both?
Clean fuel credit, that's a reference to California there?
Yeah, LCFS or clean fuel, sorry, yeah.
This. In California, you've got
this one's for Sue.
Yeah, in California, you've got a carbon cap. It's the carbon cap that double counts, with the voluntary credits being capitalized, because there's double monetization that takes place there between the capped entities and the voluntary credit. So it's not so much that the LCFS credit has been generating funding. necessarily, because the LCFS credit, although it's denominated in carbon terms, it isn't actually capitalized as a carbon offset credit. There are no additionality tests. So the question as it relates to some of the other clean fuel standards is then a little more nuanced absent that cap. There are precedents within the verified carbon standard system in which, for example, with energy efficiency carbon credits, we helped to develop the energy efficiency methodology with Chevy and a dozen university campuses. And those energy efficiency credits, are issued into the market covering a whole host of different energy efficiency practices that the campuses have been putting in place to deliver phenomenal leading edge performance. At the same time, there can be incentives. There are incentives that utilities provide in order to help speed the adoption of some of those energy efficiency practices. The verified carbon standard does not consider that an incentive for energy efficiency per se double counts with the capitalizing of a carbon credit for energy efficiency. And so there is a rubric there within the VCS system that would suggest that double counting relative to clean fuel standards absent a cap need not necessarily double count. So there are a number of nuances there, and happy to have follow-up conversations in that context.
And then we'll wrap up. Could one utilize a DER development scheme microgrid to feed increased carbon credit generation for EV charger only projects inside and outside of the service territory of a utility offtake partnership? This is very specific, and specifically to a real estate owner built environment asset where only EV charging stations may be located. Feel free to dive into that or read it again. This is very detailed. Thank you, Michael.
Well, it's a really good question. I'll take it. It's a little bit technical, but the reality is, so we are fueling more and more electric cars all over the place, and so for a company like Volta that has like incredible utilization with the load that's 10x more than every other company out there, how can we translate that into demand response? Because we can predict what we are going to fuel for all of the cars that are going, because we see it and we have history, and that's how DER has been done so far. Can we do it better? Can we do it in a much more intelligent way? Absolutely. And the reason is because we bring together artificial intelligence and where people move and where people go and where people are going to park and where people are going to plug their car. And we match this with essentially the load that's going to be on the grid. So for all our friends out there, that are from utilities, I welcome a good chat about what we can do. It's unbelievable what we can do today, just based on what we've learned just the past few days. And I'm not talking about the past year because I didn't like it. All right.
Well,
I will end it on that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Just briefly to that question, I think it's asking about whether microgrids with renewables can feed into a project inside or outside of its utility region, to clients that might have EV charging systems in place based on their location. The simple answer to that is, if there is some form through which the renewables are being kind of directly applied to those charging systems, then that will count as renewables. Great.
Any last comment on why partners should join?
Only reiterating before, other than we're nice people who are great to talk to, we've got those distinct advantages where if you are so inclined, you could absolutely do this yourself, but you're not going to be able to secure as generous terms when it comes to the ability to do crediting for EV charging, whether it's looking back to steel that's already in the ground, infrastructure that you put in place mid-2016 moving forward. If you've got assets that came in during those years, they'd be stranded when it comes to crediting unless you bring them in under the Green Banks project umbrella. And the ability to credit out for 30 years rather than 21 years. If those are important to you, particularly the grandfathering of chargers that were installed back to 2016, you should talk to us right now. And you should really be seeking us to set up those phone calls for the coming weeks because of our plans to transact out by the middle of 2021, or else that opportunity is gone. So that should really drive the urgency when it comes to setting up these conversations to speak with Sumac. As well as your enthusiasm for talking to a couple of great people.
Thank you so much for joining us. There will be a recap sent out in the next day or so. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to send us some emails to Matt, Sue, and I. And thank you also so much to Dr. Abdellah from Volta. Thank you so much for joining us. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.